Welcome to episode 3 of season 2 of Taking Back the Narratives podcast. Today, I am absolutely thrilled to welcome Jonathan Karten, founder and CEO of the Iftach Group, to talk about bringing the Moroccan Jewish experience, historical and cultural, into the forefront. So a lot of people, Jonathan, ask me, why do I, as an Ashkenaz Jew, am so focused on highlighting the Mizrahi experience this season? And I'll tell you the truth is that well, first of all, I didn't even know that I was Jewish until I was 7, 8 years old.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And when I found out, my community, I grew up in northern New Jersey, very secular community. And the Jews in my area were all Ashkenaz, except for I think one family that was Turkish Jewish, but they never really talked about their background. So to me, it was an anomaly. It was something exotic, right? It was an outlier. And so from childhood to early adulthood, I not sure if you know, but I also was anti-Israel for 20 years until I became a Zionist in 2014. The Jewish narrative was always very Ashkenaz. And so I truly believed that all Jews were Ashkenaz Jews. And then I remember my first trip to Israel. I was 2013, and I saw a lot of Jews, different skin colors. And I remember I asked my parents, I said, I thought this was a Jewish majority country. And they looked at me quizzically and they said, Yes." And I said, well, how come not a lot of people here look like the Jews back home? So that's when I learned about different types of Jews. But still, it resonated with me that the narrative in America, especially, is from an Ashkenaz perspective. And when I became a Zionist in 2014, I realized that one of the ways to combat anti-Semitism, besides accurate Zionism education, of course, is to also, talk about and share about the Sephardim, the Mizrahi. If you think about Jews, because we not only are a faith, we're also a race, we're a people. If you think about it like a pie chart, just talking about Ashkenaz Jews is only talking about one segment of the pie chart of the Jewish experience. And what about the other 2/3? And then that also lends to anti-Semitism, because that's when the anti-Semites come in and they'll lie and they say, oh, Ashkenaz Jews, they are quote unquote white appearing, even though no, no genetic Jew is actually genetically, racially white. And they'll say, oh, so those are the fake Jews who stole the land of the Arabs in Israel, because all the Jews left for 2,000 years. And so we're going to get into this later in the podcast. What about the Sephardim that held down the fort for hundreds of years in Israel? What about the early Aliyahs that were dominated actually by Mizrahi Jews? So I think a complete picture and an honest picture is well needed
I
to
couldn't agree more. I
truly
couldn't agree
push
more.
back. So
I just would note that at the end of the day, a Jew is a Jew is a Jew.
exactly.
And even though there are certain delineations
Mhm.
over the years, because we've been spread around the world for the past 2 millennia, we still are of the same family and deserving of all the same rights. So the argument that I hear sometimes that Israel is a country founded by this colonialist empire that decided to come and invade the land, I think is a complete farce. Where's the metropole? Where's the periphery?
Mhm.
There were Jews living there, continuously for the past 2,000 years. And as you said earlier, the first Aliyah movement was a Sephardic movement as well.
Absolutely.
So
And they were
the
also, and also,
justification, just I wanted to make the justification that, hey, there are some Jews that are also brown, therefore they can't all be invaders, I think is a really, really crazy statement to make. We weren't ever considered part of the majority, or at least respected as part of the majority in any country that we were in, whether North Africa, Middle East, or Europe.
absolutely true. And I know my parents, they grew up in Belarus. They were not considered Belarusian. They had a big J in their passport for Jew. And just to add, before we're going to jump into your very, illustrious history, as a Moroccan Jew in your family, is that even Ashkenaz Jews, they didn't just pop up in the Ashkenaz region of Europe. We, like, all Ashkenaz started off as Sephardic Jews. Either they came in to Europe through Italy as either slaves, or before that merchants, or they came in through the Iberian Peninsula. And then when they were expelled, they just kept moving east. And the first Jewish community in the Ashkenaz region were Italian Jews. So
So
we,
I wouldn't necessarily say that they came in as Sephardic Jews, because Sfarad refers to Jews of the Iberian Peninsula, and the Jews that came after the destruction of the Second Temple into Italy, and from there into the region, then known as the Confederation of the Rhine, never actually passed through Spain to begin with. But yes, we're all native Judeans. We're all indigenous to
absolutely.
Judea. Yeah.
Absolutely. And even DNA test. I did my own DNA test. It came back 92% Ashkenaz and 8% Sephardic, and broke it
Yeah.
down. Right.
I'm fearful of bringing DNA into this, only because some people believe, okay, therefore there is the right and the legitimacy for you to live in that land. I hate to point to eugenics. It's being part of a tribe and a culture that stems from a land that gives you the right to live in that land. Being from home allows you to be in the home. It's very tautological, but it's true. And so I never say, okay, because you are 3% Ashkenazi, 7%
Right.
Sephardic, 90%, therefore you're more or less a Jew than someone else.
Oh, no, no, not that. I just meant, like, well, first of all, genetics definitely, religion. Judaism is not a religion; it's a faith. So, faith aside, and we're a people. Faith aside, genetics has proven that Jews are from the land. Right, the J1 haplogroup is centered in Israel. Jewish genetics have very much solidified that we concretely are from there. But you're right, like, percentages don't matter. But it's interesting, right? Because I just wanted to push back on the fact that a lot of people I hear, they literally think that Ashkenaz Jews just happen to spring up from nowhere in the Rhineland, and that's not true. So I don't know why, but every time I have watched your videos from your trips to Morocco, I feel like I have been there before, even though I have not. And Morocco is on my definitely high on my list.
Come visit. I'll be there next month. Come say hi.
Perfect. Perfect. So I wanted to ask, so your sense of self as a Moroccan Jew, how strong is it in terms of your Moroccan Jewish identity versus overall Jewish identity? And how do you see Mizrahi Jews overall as part of the Jewish fabric?
So a fantastic question.
Mhm.
Well, let me just preface it with saying that when my grandparents on my mother's side, the Moroccan side, needed to be considered full Moroccan citizens, they weren't. They were considered Jews and had a very difficult time making Aliyah. When my grandparents on my father's side needed to be considered Polish, they weren't. They were considered Jews, and therefore had to go through the hardships of the Holocaust. So at the end of the day, I'm first a Jew, and then my nation, my culture, etc., follows the fact that I am loyal to, and my first set of priorities to the longest set of community, which is my Judaism, my ethnoculture. That might be a bit confusing because I said culture in two different respects. Nonetheless, after the fact that I consider myself first Jewish, I do consider myself Moroccan as well. I speak the language, I eat the food, I try to visit as often as I can, and I have a love for the people that accepted my family for 2,000 years. I mean, my grandfather's side is a Berber Jew. Amazigh, they like to be referred to as, and they came after the destruction of the first temple, and really before the spread of Islam into the North African countries of Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, Libya, etc. This is like 700 years before Saladin ever came about. So they were Moroccan before Morocco was Islamic to begin with. And in fact, the Moroccan flag used to have a big Star of David in the center, which has recently changed post 48. So the concept of Jews being guests in Morocco as a minority was a fairly recent, if you look at the horizon of the past 5,000 years, not of the past 1,000 years. So I do find that Morocco has been, obviously there are times where there were kings that were more favorable to Jews and kings that were less favorable to Jews. But throughout history, it allowed for my family to be safe, secure, and to sustain themselves. So I owe a debt of gratitude for the relationship. Obviously, in '73, Morocco was a belligerent nation, and fought against Israel. And but at the same time, in 39 to 45, they tried to the best of their ability to protect their Jewish populace. And when King Muhammad was asked to give up his Jews, so to speak, he responded to Hitler and said, I guess it was to Rommel at the time, who was the leader of the North African Nazi forces, Axis forces. He said, there are no Jews in Morocco, there are just subjects of the crown. And so we have this sort of love-hate relationship. But for the most part, if you go back now to Morocco after the Abraham Accords, there is a sense of bledkum. This is your nation as well. And so for that reason, I consider myself a proud Moroccan Jew. But I do understand that that comes with some added baggage as well. I can go into detail any particular part if you'd like.
Yeah, so actually, to me, that's fascinating. So you mentioned a mostly positive relationship with the Arab population for the past 2,000 years, and of course, pre-Arab.
We did pay jizya for about 2,000 years or so. We were considered second-class citizens. We did have to walk on the side of the street or to the left of any Muslim walking past us. If there was a Muslim on a horse, we would have to get off of our horse to not be taller than the Muslim person. But relative to Europe, it was a I don't want to say a complete walk in the park, but it wasn't, I would say, as severe in terms of general rights. And I think for that reason, I owe a bit of gratitude.
And so I wanted to backtrack a little bit. So, there are governmental rules, and then there's everyday life. So when you hear stories of your family at the Moroccan side, what do they share personally, and any stories from past generations, like your great
Sure.
grandparents, your great grandparents, in terms of relations with non-Jewish neighbors?
So my grandmother uh, tells two stories that I think perfectly highlight the relationship between herself and her Muslim neighbors. One side of the story was when she was giving birth, and when her neighbor was giving birth, and say her neighbor didn't have enough milk to feed her baby, they would exchange breast milk. They would essentially suckle their neighbor's children at their teat, which I think is the most intimate neighborly relation you can possibly have. And that's not just my grandmother's story. There's many stories like that. So I think interpersonally, there was a very, very close relationship. On the other hand, there were certain neighbors that every 50 or so years wanted to revolt against with who they saw as the oppressor or the I guess you can say the representative of the crown, and that is usually the Jew, and it happened the same way in Europe. So she tells a story of her uncle, who in the 50s was pulled out of well. What had happened was he was on the side of a road and didn't get to the left side, as is by law requested from Jews who are, let's say, on a horse versus a pedestrian. So if you're on a horse, you have to get off the horse and walk if there's a Muslim that's a pedestrian. And he didn't do that. And so the individual killed him and put him, tried to hide his body in a well. And she remembers distinctly having to pull out the body from the well and putting the body on top of the car. And I don't want to get into too much detail, it's a bit grotesque, but that was a core memory for her. And she remembers having to run away to Israel as well with her parents and grandparents, and the entire journey was in secret.
Mhm.
So yes, there were neighbors that were incredibly close, but also there was always the ability that one day they can completely change their opinion of you. So there was this fear and suspicion. The terminology now in Hebrew is chabdeu v'chashdeu, respected but be suspicious of.
I am so sorry to hear what happened to that. That is just mind blowing that someone could do that over a rule that was broken. So speaking of dimitude, was it always actually enforced? Because I know that in Israel under the Ottoman Empire, dimitude definitely existed, but it was not always enforced, and it was enforced depending on the ruler. Some rulers couldn't care less. Some rulers were very much into upholding second-class citizens. And also, I know that in the Ottoman Empire, at least, Christians got it much worse than Jews, because Muslims consider Christians even beneath Jews. So in Morocco, how was it? Do you know, like, if it was
I wasn't raised
regardless
in
of
Morocco.
ruler or
I wasn't raised in
right.
Morocco, but what I did know is that friends of ours that were closer to the crown didn't have to pay the same taxes, jizya. But I'm not sure if that was a function of their relationship to the government, or specifically because the government felt it's not okay for them to pay jizya as a dhimmi. So it may have just been a function of their ability to get the right deal at the right time, as opposed to any sense of moral obligation to not have to pay for being a different religion.
And so this may sound a little bit ignorant to ask, but I'm going to ask anyway because there are people who could be listening have the same question. In Morocco, I always hear about, Berbers and Muslims and Jews. Is there a Christian population in Morocco?
There is a Christian population in Morocco. So the reason they're called Berbers or Amazirs is because the French refer to the whole northern portion of West Africa as the Barbary Coast.
Mhm.
And so the indigenous people of the Atlas Mountains, who they couldn't quite understand and didn't have much of a written language, were referred to as barbarians. So they like to be called Amazirs because they feel that the term is a bit derogatory. But the regards to Jews, I'll talk first about Jews and then I'll go on to Christians. There were three main aliyot, or called them yeridot,
Mhm.
to North Africa, specifically to Morocco. The first one is after the destruction of the first temple, and that had a push of Berber Jews who really became part of the indigenous population. They shared some rituals like painting of their face. They shared language. They shared um, music, and they actually brought the written word to Amazigh. So you'll find a lot of Amazigh letters are similar to Hebrew letters. After that, you have the push of Islam into North Africa, and with that, the trade routes along North Africa as well from the Arabian Peninsula. And then after that, that's around 700 AD, 700, 800 AD. The first one we're talking is, prior, like talking destruction of the first temple, 536 BCE. So it's a big gap, about 1,000 or so years, 1,200 years. After that, you have another push of 1492, the Spanish Inquisition, and the Jews that came through Portugal to Morocco and Algeria and Tunisia, et cetera, et cetera. So you have really three different subpopulations within Morocco, and they all spoke different languages as well, right? So you had in the north, in the Andalus regions, you had Jews speaking Ladino.
Mhm.
The southernmost regions, you had Judeo-Arabic. Yeah, and then obviously you had Darija, which came about after French colonization of Morocco, which was kind of like a combination of French and Arabic together.
Interesting. I
So
didn't know about that.
yeah, so you have three different types of Moroccan Jews. The Christian Moroccan population, I can't speak to as intellectually, but I know there were always tradesmen and merchants living in the area, and that especially during the time post the Moorish uh, invasion of North Africa and then the subsequent Spanish Inquisition, trade between both Christians and Muslims in North Africa and in Spain, and especially in Gibraltar, what today is known as the Andalus region.
Interesting. So Jews are not the only external minority in Morocco.
They're not the only external minority. I would say that during the period post the Spanish Inquisition, they had it worse. The Christians possibly had it worse, simply because they were considered the invaders, and for a long time they held Muslim slaves as well in Tangier, in Gibraltar, and in the southern portion of Spain. And for that reason, I think that at least within most recent history, now recent in terms of Jews is very hard to say, but in the past 500 years or so, which I consider recent history, they've had a harder time, a harder go at it.
Right. And so you mentioned your grandmother's secret escape to Israel.
And my
And
grandfather,
and your grandfather. And so I
they
wanted,
just met each other in Israel.
oh, that's so sweet. So I wanted to clear up some misconceptions or some conflicting stories because what actually happened after 1948? Because I'm reading some accounts that Jews were forcibly expelled. Other Jews I've heard and read that they said that many Jews left on their own accord after 48. So if you could shed a little bit
It's a
light.
big,
Mhm.
right. So at first, and then this is a couple of conflicting theories, but I can tell you what happened to my family personally, and then I can tell you what think actually happened, right? So my grandfather worked with, at the time, the Jewish National Fund to actually bring Jews back to from Morocco to Israel, but the king didn't allow them to leave. At first, they didn't. And again, there's obviously three major push into Israel from Morocco, right? I'm talking post the creation of the modern state of Israel.
Mhm.
Um, with the majority of them coming then of Morocco in the time of the 50s, requested a ransom for the Jews that were living in Morocco. And Israel, I think, paid, and don't quote me on this, but it was something like 100 to 150, the equivalent of dollars today, per Jew that requested to leave. But the thing is, the Jews didn't necessarily want to leave prior to 48. There were many Jews who, prior to 48, weren't as Zionistic, but because of the increasing anti-Semitism post the creation of the modern state of Israel, and I say specifically the creation of the modern state of Israel because there was always a significant Jewish population in Israel prior to 48. The sentiment made it such that it was actually impossible to remain. And those that only remained in Morocco were those that couldn't leave their assets, who felt that the time wasn't right and actually held on as much as they could to their position and into their lifestyle until really the late 60s, early 70s, when they found that it was unbearable. And this was roughly 3 years before the war of Yom Kippur, when Morocco actually joined Arab countries in fighting Israel. So in roughly 70, 71, a majority of the remaining Jews left. And today there are the small pockets of Jews, and there's some Jews coming back to Morocco as well. But to answer your question, there were certain Jews that wanted to leave as soon as they could, prior to even the creation of the state of Israel for Zionistic reasons. And after, between 39 to 45, when the economic situation in Morocco became dire, that even exacerbated a need to leave the country as well. Post World War II and into the modern state of Israel, increased anti-Semitism led for a push that the Moroccan government wasn't willing to release. The Moroccan government did not want the Jews to leave. And so they made it very, very difficult for them to leave. And only after Israel paid the ransom, they allowed their Jews to leave. So all three stories are true. There are some Jews who wanted to leave on their own accord who weren't allowed to leave. There were certain Jews that wanted to actually remain, that were kicked out of their village or of their city because they were Jews holding positions of power. And that wasn't well respected, especially during 39 to 45. And there are also Jews who waited really until the 60s and 70s to leave altogether because Morocco was gearing up for war against Israel and they were considered spies. In fact, I actually had a nice Sukkot Chag with Lugassi family, Charles Lugassi, who actually left in the 70s, who told me his first-hand account of having to escape to Israel because there was a pogrom in Marrakesh. And he heard on the radio of the Jewish spies that are living within your corridors. And so he thought, okay, if I'm hearing this, everyone in my city is hearing this, and they're going to come looking for me and for my family. So he decided to leave. And he would get different reports of the war as well. He would hear one report from an Israeli news channel, and then the next report, Moroccan news channel or Arab news channel, saying that Israel had lost the war. So he didn't even know if there was a place to escape to. Anyway, it's I would say all three stories are true, depending on what point in time you're referring to them as. Personally, for my family, my grandmother's left in the 50s, and so did my grandfather. My grandmother left from an area of the city center called Laznagia. My grandfather from Tuama, the Atlas Mountains, a bit farther away. They both met up in Israel, and that's where they were married.
No, thank you so much for shedding light because it's important to understand it. It seemed very much family to family, depending on how they ended up back in Israel. And so, and also thank you for shedding light that there always was in Israel. That's like myself, I'm a Zionism educator. I always say that Israel was liberated in 1948 because it was true. It was Jews who liberated Israel from British occupation. And they valiantly fought for nearly 20 years to achieve that independence. Meanwhile, the UN was doing everything to inhibit independence and sovereignty, right? And all UN did was just merely recognize, finally, the sovereignty of Israel. So you shared a very emotional trip to Morocco recently, where you saw your grandfather's house, if I remember correctly, and you even bought his tefillin back from the current Arab owner. I shed many tears watching that video. So how did that trip come about originally?
Wow. So I was contacted by Shama Mahtli, who's a cultural ambassador in Morocco, who was putting on a trip to bring Israeli venture capitalists and American angel investors to Morocco to help the economy kind of mimic what Israel has done in the Arabian Peninsula. And they wanted to shed light on how Morocco can do the same. So I agreed to being part of that diplomatic trip and decided to go there really 2 weeks after I was asked. So it was like really quick planning and without much forethought. Once I got there, though, the trip was fantastic. We went to Rabat and to Essaouira and into Fez and Casablanca, but we really only had 2 days in Morocco proper. The first day was all business, so there was not really much time to actually look for any family roots. And this is again the first time I've been in Morocco since I was maybe 3 years old. So it's the first time, at least as an adult, being in Morocco. After which, on the second day, I had a little bit more free time. It was also Shabbat, but I keep Shabbat. I don't use my phone and wallet, and I didn't exactly know where my grandparents' house was. So I remembered to call my great grandmother prior, who's thank God she's still with us after seeing me. I love you if you're hearing this. um, she said that there was a man by the name of David Ochayon, and if you can find him, he can show you where our house was. He can show you where they used to own land. He can even show you where the Nazis came and took my great grandfather. And she doesn't exactly know where he lives, but if you go to Morocco in the Jewish area, maybe somebody knows of him. And I said, are you sure you don't know the address? Maybe the name of his address close by is Ana Metasafebni. Like, I'm so sorry, my son, I can't remember. And so I went and we were knocking on doors to the area of the Malach. And I started asking him, if I'm with David Ochayon, if I know what, that Adish, like, do you know where David Ochayon is? You know where I can find him? And everyone's like, I'm so sorry, I can't help you. And then I went to the next door. Do you know who David Ochayon is? I'm looking for him. No, I'm sorry, I can help you. That went on for about an hour. Again, no phone, no wallet. There are about 450,000 people that live in Marrakesh. And, we get roughly 2 million like tourists as well annually. So it's not exactly an easy feat, but I figured I'd try.
It's like a needle in a haystack trying to find.
Exactly. And then I see a guy with a kippah. So I start to walk after him. And he begins to walk more quickly because he sees a guy, without a kippah, with a beard, like walking after him like steadily. So he begins to, lightly jog. So I begin to lightly jog, and he begins to run into this full sprint, and I'm just running after this guy. And I finally grab him. I'm like, "Ana Yehud, come on, lachda min fadlik. I'm also a Jew. Relax. Take a second thing." I pull out my chai, and he begins to relax, and he says, "What do you want from me?" And I said, "I'm looking for David Ochayon. I'm trying to figure out, where my family is from. I'm a Moroccan Jew." And he says, "Well, I know where his store is. I can take you to his store." I get to his store. It's Shabbat. It's closed, obviously. I didn't think twice. So there it is. I said, I tried my best. I did my shtatlut. I'm done for today. I'm going to go back to the hotel. And he says, before you go, maybe you want to come with me to the shul or something, get to know the Jewish community. I know you couldn't find David Ochayon, but come nonetheless. I said, all right. And he takes me to this little alleyway into these like really close by marketplaces. And I get into this tiny little hole, and inside it's this beautiful ornamented synagogue. And I sit there, and I got an aliyah, and I was davening. During the kiddush, man started staring at me, and I looked away, and he continued to stare at me. It got to a point where it was a bit uncomfortable. So I approached him and I said, "Is everything all right?" He said, "Do you know a man by the name of Moshe Deri?" And I said, "That's my great grandfather's name, but like the likely Moshe Deri is like John Smith.
Oh, okay.
It's a very common name." He said, "Wait here." He goes to the back, pulls out this huge 1 meter by 1 meter oil painting on canvas, and it's my great grandfather. And he says, "Yeah, he married Simi, and he has his daughter Chana and Rafael and Uriel," and starts naming all of my great uncles. And I'm like, "Yeah, that's him. That's him." Apparently, I look like him. And so he said, "You're sitting in a synagogue in Slal Jama," and I said, I had goosebumps. I said, "There's no way." He's like, "Yeah." He goes, shows me some of the pictures. He made it into a little Jewish museum there. I told him, "Look, I'm looking for a guy, David Ochayon, who was supposed to show me around the area." He goes, "Ah, hey, Ibni, Ana David Ochayon." "Oh, my son, I'm David Ochayon." And that was fantastic. It took me around for the following 2 days. He connected me to one of his workers who brought me to the old village of Ladznagia. And there was a complete closure for me after not having been able to find any shred of evidence prior. When I got to the village, that's when things started to get a little bit crazy. Because when I got there, I started taking around like photos of my family. But again, these are like 40 years after they left the country. So what's the likelihood that somebody recognizes somebody 40 years later as an older man? And I happened to stumble on this woman who was the great granddaughter of the right hand man of my great grandfather.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And her great grandmother is still alive. And I was able to have a FaceTime myself, my great grandmother, that is the wife of my great grandfather, and the wife of my great grandfather's right hand man. And they were able to talk to each other. And that was completely because they'd never thought they'd ever see each other again. And they remember playing together as children and just being able to see them, with already great grandchildren having this really odd, surreal conversation. I think that's really what allowed for them to trust me a bit more, invite me into their house. And then that was a bit shocking because what I didn't anticipate what happened was they kept on to my great grandfather's old ID, 1892. And they had his old tallis bag as well. And the current owner said, look, we get Jews coming in here every once in a while, and we show them the old Jewish quarter, and we show them this tallis bag and this ID as proof that there were Jews once here. And I said, look, I need to show this to my grandparents. I can't just like leave this here. So we negotiated a price, and I was able to get what I call them, like, family heirlooms, but he calls them artifacts, back into Israel. I actually bought a flight the next day, and instead of going back to New York, I flew directly to Tel Aviv, and then from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem to show my grandparents. And it was fortunate that I did, because about 3 days later, my grandfather passed away, and I was able to be with him during his last moment, the last Shabbat that he had. And that was all because of this very serendipitous moment in Morocco.
And that's all because you were a very good runner and you caught up to that.
Man plans and God laughs, I think.
Imagine if you didn't, right? Maybe that story would not have unfolded. I saw that video where you were showing your great grandmother, right? That was just heart wrenching and beautiful.
She was shocked. She was totally shocked. Yeah.
Right. Who would have known, right? Like that anyone would have that connection still, and in that location. So I was just wondering, do the Arabs in Morocco know the history of the Jews and what happened post 1948, or were they told something different from the government?
So you have in Morocco a spectrum, right? There are those that are very kind to Jews and very literate, and they are, I guess you can say, metropolitan people, and therefore um, are a bit more empathetic and sympathetic with the Jewish cause. And there are those who, like in every country, don't get the same education. But on a whole, what happened was post 48, there was a big government push to demonize Israel. And although on the ground, because it's still a rather feudalist system, it's a post-feudalist system, on the ground, neighbors still remembered the Jews that lived amongst them and loved them for it. You had this sort of slight insemination of anti-Semitism from the top down, really culminating in 1973. Post 1973, with the increase of the saliency of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the eventual partnership, trade partnership between the United States, Israel, and Morocco, you had a change of opinion. And the new king actually really wanted to repair the Jewish-Muslim relations, and specifically the Moroccan Muslim and indigenous population relations. And so King Mohammed VI mandated that all the synagogues be rehabilitated and renovated, that all the cemeteries be rehabilitated and renovated out of his own pocket, mind you, not from the treasury. And he also had all of the signs be written in Amazigh as well as in Arabic lettering, and kind of tried to create for a more populist Morocco, as populist as a monarchical system can be. When that was happening, you began to see the Jews who were a bit more successful that had remained in Morocco begin to get a bit more recognition. And so the current climate today is where the Moroccan elite are in favor of Jews and of Israel, because the kingdom is in favor of Jews and of Israel, but the, for lack of a better term, modern proletariat, we can call them, still have that anti-Semitic undertones that was really not there to begin with. That was kind of pushed on them in the 70s and 80s. So it's a re-education that needs to happen from the top down. But on the whole, I told you during Shabbat, I walk around Marrakesh, a very busy city, with my kippah on. And most of the people who are trying to sell you things will say, "Inte bladkum, ruch behun, come in, like inte walad, you're my son, you're part of this family, this is your country." Every once in a while, I get Free Palestine or some anti-Semitic remark, but there's, for every one of those, I get 10 very welcoming sentiments. And I've had beautiful relations rekindled there. I've been back 3 times, and I'm actually even investing there as well. So I consider it a road to peace with the rest of the Muslim countries, not just in North Africa, but hopefully also in the Middle East. And I think that if it can be done properly in Morocco, it can be exported hopefully to other Gulf countries. I'm not too bullish on Algeria or Tunisia, which to begin with don't have good relations with Morocco. I'm not too bullish on the Shiite Crescent as well. But I do think that it is a good petri dish for how peace can function in the future of the region.
Now, do you think, so I was just in Saudi Arabia 6 months ago. I was in Jeddah, and very clearly you can see that the top-down push of what Mohammed bin Salman did had an immediate effect on the population. My tour guide, and this was not a Jewish tour, was saying how Jerusalem is not at all important to Islam. They only care about Mecca and Medina. They were pushing back on the false Arab narrative about Israel. I know that Mohammed bin Salman got rid of anti-Semitism in the media and the mosques and the schools. So suddenly you have the majority of the Saudi population, which is fairly young. They are now becoming more pro-Israel. I was also in the UAE twice. And what I found fascinating, so the first time I was there on a Jewish tour, and it's tricky to go on Jewish tours because things are more sugar-coated for the participants. So when I was there a year ago, everything was rosy and lovely. The entire country is pro-Israel. Come back 6 months later, non-Jewish tour. And I did not interact with Emiratis on this tour, but with Emiratis make up 12% of the population. The rest are, as you know, like Muslims from anywhere from Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, tend to be very anti-Israel. And we saw that firsthand. It's not that I hide that I'm Jewish when I travel to Arab countries, but I'm of the mindset, if asked, I will tell. If don't ask, I'm not going to tell. So we had a Pakistani Muslim driver and a Indian Muslim tour guide, which was interesting because back home they would be at odds, but in Dubai they were best of friends. But both of them were quite anti-Israel, and so it was a dichotomous attitude from the minority Emirati population, right? So luckily with the UAE, it's a monarchy, it's a police state. So it does not matter what the majority thinks about the Abraham Accords. The government will never renege on the Accords, right? Because the trade is going up, that they're benefiting.
I think we always have to be careful that we don't speak in absolutism.
Right.
It's always possible that the government will renege, and we have to hope for the best and plan for the worst in that sense. I want to let you finish it.
No, you bring up an excellent point. What do you think? So what, and I know we didn't talk about this before, but what factors would contribute to the UAE reneging?
Reneging?
Yeah.
Well, right now, I think we've made, just from my perspective, I'm not speaking in the name of anybody or affiliates that I work with. Yeah. Trade is a huge factor. And the fact that even before the Abraham Accords, we had $3.2 trillion in bilateral trade definitely helped. But we could have gone on just as easily without any formal diplomatic relations in the same respect. And it probably would have been cheaper for the tradesmen on the ground because they wouldn't have to pay the increase in tariffs. The real reason I think that the Abraham Accords was successful to begin with was because we had a common enemy. and it made strange bedfellows of us. The Gulf states were in this, horns were locked with Iran, North Iraq, North Syria, and the Shiite Crescent, and we provided a service, which is a technological service and a political one, to bolster their military in Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and the Emiratis, and B, to provide them with the same military technology that Israel has to begin with. So as much as it was a helpful for trade relations, it was more realpolitik. They needed us, we needed them, and it made for a good deal at the current time. I'm not sure if you've been following what's going on in the news lately, but China just brokered a deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and it's going to lead to de-dollarization of the energy sector. So I'm not so confident that Saudi Arabia will continue in the same line as Bahrain, Morocco, and the Emiratis. But even if they don't, I'm not too confident. One moment. I apologize. Right. So after the de-dollarization of the energy sector and the broker deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia through China, I feel that our geopolitical power in the region has lessened. So the Emiratis and the Saudi Arabians see some daylight between the United States and America, which is factor A. Factor B, they see America's purchasing power parity declined. So even if they are within that pact, it's not as beneficial to them. B. And C, if there's no longer the same military threat between Iran and Saudi Arabia, or just the Gulf countries, Iran and the Shiite Crescent, then they're no longer going to need us as much in the long term. So that's why I say we should hope for the best and plan for the worst.
Absolutely. Or, I mean, maybe this is me just being more positive from what I have seen on the ground a little bit in Saudi Arabia. Perhaps Saudi Arabia can push, can push Iran, as we know that the majority of the population, or so it seems, is anti the regime. And so maybe, and it's to their detriment if the current regime is going to remain there. So we never know. You're right. It could be 50-50.
I would love that to be the case. Trust me. My father remembers a time when doing trade in Iran was laissez-faire and easy for foreigners to access. And if it can go back the way it was, we'd all be very happy for it. But I'm not putting my eggs in that basket.
Right. Exactly. So do you think, so you're talking about, more normalization is going on right now with Morocco, and I see it too. So, I have an account, Zionism education account, and the Arab participation is greatly increasing. And especially I see it from Egypt and Morocco. Egypt I was surprised about because I know it's similar with the main population still being fairly anti-Semitic. But now there's a Morocco-Israel Alliance group, Friends of Israel, and we are Proud Moroccans group. So I'm seeing these groups basically multiply on a monthly basis. So hopefully something will move.
Inshallah.
Forward. Yeah. But do you see the government playing a role in it, or do you see more people like yourself and more on the ground groups moving forward with?
You're talking about Morocco specifically, okay. I think that the government at its first played the largest role in it and normalized the relations. And now if it wants to continue, it's people on the ground that need to create bilateral relations. I think that they can only open the door. The government can only open the door and add some push. For people to follow through, there needs to be person-to-person contact. And I think this is true with every major conflict. Like if you look, for example, at Europe after World War II, with the Marshall Plan, you had 17 warring countries who all decided to come together within the European Union, even though the past 200 years, 2 centuries, they were at war with each other. Why was that? It wasn't because they decided to come around the campfire and sing Kumbaya songs with the ukulele. It was because England was the main desalinator of iron ore. Germany was the main distributor of iron ore. They needed each other to increase their GDP. Not only did they not want to fight each other, but if either one of them was to be hampered or hurt, then the other one would not be as successful. So I think that business is the road to communication and communication to tolerance. And then, the government plays catch up. But they are helpful in the sense that they can increase government subsidies for bilateral relations. They can normalize relations on the ground. They can make certain actions illegal that might put impediments for trade in the region. But on the whole, it's up to the people on the ground to ensure that the peace that they started remains. And there have been a lot of flip-floppers within Israel's recent 60, 70 years. So I wouldn't count on everything being in absolute terms, but I hope that it is in absolute terms, that the peace remains the way it is.
No, you're absolutely right. Everything in life is nuanced, including especially new relations. So I would be remiss if we did not address the elephant in the room when it comes to Mizrahi Jews and Israel. So Israel today, everyone knows it's finally seen as a Middle Eastern country that it is, and the culture is predominantly Sephardic Mizrahi. Is the anti-Mizrahi stance of the post-liberation early years finally being addressed, or do you think it's more suppressed? And the reason I bring it up, I know that one of my favorite musical groups, AWA, they're a Yemenite Jewish band. They're three sisters. So they frequently address what happened to Yemenite Jews post Aliyah. Do other Mizrahi cultural groups also address the anti-Mizrahi early experience?
Yeah, I think that for the most part,
opinion?
so I can talk to you personally from my family's perspective. When my grandmother first came to Israel in the port of Tripoli, she was separated from her parents and was told that she would see them in a week's time. There just wasn't enough room on the same ship going forward. That wasn't true. She was essentially given to another family in Tripoli, a family that didn't have any children. And because she was one of 12, she was seen as dispensable. Eventually, my great-grandfather took all of the passports from all of the passengers on the ship and went to the captain and said, "We're not leaving the port until I see my daughter back." And that's what forced them to come back. But there were countless stories like this where Mizrahi families, I'll call them Sephardic families, because they're not all Mizrach of Israel and all the west of Israel, where Sephardic families were separated and their wealth was stolen. My great-grandfather brought with him from Morocco a mattress full of gold from the sale of his operations in Morocco. And he was told to, he'll see his possessions at the port in Haifa. When he got to the port in Haifa, he was told that the ship with all the possessions had burnt down. And he said, "Okay, well, gold doesn't burn. Tell me the location where it burned down. I'll send a team." And they never actually ever followed up. And then when they got to Israel, they lived in Mabarot. And regardless of their education or their background, they were forced into manual labor. But these are the times. This was like post-World War II. And as much as I think that there is valid reason to complain about the onset of Mizrahi or Sephardic relations with the modern state of Israel, I don't think it does much service to air dirty laundry. And I think that the intermarriage rate between Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews and the general assimilation of Israeli culture into one homogenous group will do away with the pain of our past. Mm-hmm. And in that era, you find it also with the Russian immigration, right, where they were considered second-class citizens, and then the Ethiopian immigration, and most recently the Eritrean and the Sudanese immigration, where every generation that comes to Israel is considered second class until one generation passes, their children go to the military, and by the time 20 to 30 years passes, we're all on equal footing. Obviously, I'm saying that there is still problems in the country, and there is still segregation, and it's harder to get a job with a last name like Abutbul or Ben Chamo than it is with like Greenberg or Greenspan. But these are the least of our problems now. And the racialization of the current judicial reform in Israel is doing a detriment to the whole country, because people are saying, well, it's now the left against the right with the new judicial reform, as opposed to the caveats in the reform altogether, which is not a left or right problem, a Sephardic or Ashkenazi problem. It's a problem of democracy altogether. So I think that when we tribalize various forms of governance, we do away with the actual underlying content of what's being debated. And more concretely, in the past 6 months, you see this with the de-democratization of the country. which I think is we can get into that a bit deeper if you want, but I think it's a very detrimental part of our current existential commitment to the country.
No, true, and it's interesting that the wide range of viewpoints, because I have friends in Israel who said, like, okay, so now we are one Jew. There's no such thing as Ashkenaz, Mizrahi, Sephardic. Like you said, like we all intermarried. Everyone has Sephardic grandparents and Ashkenaz grandparents and everything. But then I also have friends who their parents were not bitter what happened, to their grandparents, but the children are. And so they want the government to finally apologize, like officially, so to say. So
I want that as well. But that's not mutually exclusive. Like I can want the government to apologize for the past, but also think that, the divides between us are no longer as relevant.
oh, absolutely, absolutely. And it's true because when I think of, for example, the Mossad and how the Mossad, I read an incredible book. I don't know if you read it, but highly recommend it to everyone who's listening. It's called Spies of No Country by Maddie Friedman. Are you
Fantastic.
familiar with the book?
I've met Maddie Friedman
Okay.
in Israel several times. He's a fantastic author.
And have you read that book specifically?
I have, yeah.
Okay. So to me, it was I mean, I kind of understood that obviously the first spies had to be Arabic speaking in order to infiltrate behind enemy lines. But I didn't realize that basically it was Mizrahi Jews who founded the Mossad. Otherwise, it would not have been possible to send in someone with blonde hair and blue eyes into Egypt or, into Syria. So do you know of other institutions that also were so greatly influenced by the Mizrahi wave of Aliyah?
Other espionage institutions?
Yeah, or
There
even
are.
or just in general.
There are other institutions that rely on Mizrahi Jews. We don't have to go into too much detail.
Okay, I understand for security. No, but it's true, right? Or even I know Fauda is based on a group. I think it's called the Duvdevin unit.
Duvdevan is a Sayeret within the paratroopers division, but it's not Duvdevan. It's based on the what's the word in English? Reservists, Duvdevan reservists that were in that particular unit. But nowadays you have Arabic-speaking Jews in every facet of society.
Mhm.
So it's not, and there are a lot of. There's not such thing as any fully Ashkenazi or fully Sephardic Jew anymore in Israel.
Right.
So it's hard to say like that now. The responsibility of the espionage activities in Israel is solely based on Sephardic or solely based on Ashkenazi efforts.
But I think it's just the credit needs to be at least like in America, in
Completely.
American history, has to be
When
elevated more.
completely I couldn't agree more. When Eli Cohen was hanged in Syria, there was this huge change of public opinion in the country, and people started to understand the various natures in which their countrymen served the defense operation as a whole. They thought Israel was only sustained and created by one type of Jew, when in actuality it was maintained by all different kinds of Jews. And I think the real credit came with the onset of Eli Cohen's unfortunate death, and also with the cultural revolution that happened in the 70s, with the Avoda Party becoming and the Labor Party, that is, becoming more prominent, and essentially the embracing of Mizrahi culture with Zohar Gov and Sirtei Borekas in the 60s and 70s, that made the Sephardic Jew essentially seen as not just a good laborer, but someone that is well respected and cool, so to speak. The idea of machismo greatly changed in that time as well. And for that reason, I think that by the 80s and 90s, there was more of a homogeneity between both cultures.
That's true. And so how do you see others knowing more about the Mizrahi and Sephardic experience integral in combating anti-Semitism as it relates to anti-Zionism?
In a utopian world, we all learned Arabic and we all intermarried, and there was no difference between the two. Respecting, obviously, the traditions of our past, but also realizing that there's a combined future. I don't think that the argument that you have brown Jews, therefore we're indigenous, holds water with me. Obviously, it's a fun like counter argument to have when someone says, "Oh, you guys are colonizers. You're from Europe," and we say, "Okay, well, no, 55% of us actually are from Arab countries that were kicked out." It's a great counter argument to have, but in actuality, 100% of us are
Exactly.
from that country. And so, if we begin to point and say, "Well, look at these Sephardic Jews, therefore we're indigenous," then we're really devaluating our own national identity.
That's absolutely true. And so how do you, and I, so you're an American citizen or you
A
just
dual citizen.
a dual citizen. So do you see Mizrahi Jewry finding a stronger voice in America as we move forward?
I don't know. It's a numbers game. I think that there definitely is more exposure, at least in my anecdotal sense. I haven't ran a big meta-analysis on every Jewish community across North
Right.
America, but anecdotally, I think there's a lot more salience for Mizrahi Jews.
Mhm.
I think that a lot of the time, people who are not so connected with their identity just confuse them for Israelis and American Jews, as opposed to Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews. But in general, I think that it's on the rise, but I don't think that like it's not the Jewish population in North America that I'd like for them to be more understanding of all different types of Jews. It's the general North American citizenry that I'd like to be more understanding of all the different types of Jews, because I think Jews do a pretty good job of knowing their own family. I don't think that the Western countries do a good job of recognizing a variety of different types of Jews.
But I think it's also incumbent on the different Jews themselves. Like, I know for myself that I live in New York. I'm part of a lot of Jewish groups. At least I used to be. My participation is dwindling a little bit. Just seeing the transparency more, but I see, like, especially being online, let's say Jewish food groups have a very Ashkenaz bent to them, or a lot of Ashkenaz Jews will say like, oh, so there's only Yiddish. Well, what about Ladino? What about Judeo-Arabic? All these other dialects. It's this 1950s suburban Jewish stereotype. Like think of I didn't watch the show, but I know the title, like Miss My
Marvelous Miss Maisel. It's a
exactly Marvelous.
fantastic show.
Yeah,
That's the
it's not a
idea.
stereotype. Yeah.
That's cultural Judaism in North America. It's what I
Right.
think non-Jews think Jews are. But I don't think that Jews think Jews are that.
It depends. Like I have a neighbor who is Ashkenaz in his early 70s. And one time and we were talking about something about Jews, and I brought up Mizrahi Jews. I think I was just a post Israel trip, and I had met some wonderful people. And he said, "What's a Mizrahi Jew?" And to
Mm,
me, that was very just bewilderment. But then again, I thought the same thing when I was younger. So I think it all depends on your exposure, right? Like if you're living in New York and all your friends, if you're Jewish and all your friends are Ashkenaz Jews, and you grew up, especially let's say in the 70s and 80s, and you haven't been to Israel or you've been once, and you're in the more Anglo communities, and I think it's just knowing, like, I feel, and I agree with you, we are one family. And so I feel like it's much stronger and better for our identity to be connected to our entire family, not
agreed.
just
No,
a
I
s-
agree. I'm very happy that you're putting it together your podcast. I'm very proud to be able to be on the show and to give more exposure to the side of Judaism. Um, and I think it's great work. One conversation at a time.
and
Absolutely fantastic. But if you go back to your neighbor and you say, I'm referring to the Franks, he might know what you're referring to, because that older generation didn't refer to them as Mizrahis, they referred to them as Frank. In
Mhm.
Yiddish, the word for Frank is Sephardic Jew. It's a bit derogatory,
Right.
but that's at least how the Jewish Ashkenazi community viewed the Sephardic community.
I just have such an affinity for and I'm not like self-hating Ashkenaz. I think there's great aspects of Ashkenaz culture. However, when I think of what music sounds better, to me, it's not Ashkenaz music. It's Mizrahi music. What food tastes better? Definitely not Ashkenaz food. To me, it's Sephardic food. And the culture, to me, it's more lively. And again, like I'm not comparing, contrasting, but I feel like more exposure, and especially going to Israel, and trying the more flavorful food and not sticking to the more, bland offerings, hearing that Sephardic music, it just, I don't know, it awakens something in my Jewish soul that was not there for over 25, 30 years. So
I
it's
have a good friend that I went to college with, and he's actually putting together this Netflix show called We Were Never Lost.
Mhm.
His name is Rudy Rachman. He has a big Israel following, and he likes to say that we complement each other very well. So just like you might be, as you said, awakened in some sense by the exposure to this new culture, I know many Sephardic Jews are awakened by the contrapositive. So I think it is, in a more spiritual way, a coalition of the family, and it's beautiful to hear.
It's true. And I just found out about Bobby Sali.
Baba Sali,
Baba Saleh.
what
Again,
about him?
never knew all the covers of different Moroccan rabbis. It's wonderful. It's an expansion of Jewish knowledge.
Right. I'm fearful of the deification of Moroccan rabbis,
Mhm.
and same with Ashkenazi rabbis as well. I think it's great to go to the Hilullah and to be together. I don't like the deification though of because it's anti-Judaism in that sense, right? Taking a person and saying that they're godly or closer to God. Therefore, if I go to this cemetery, I'll be closer to God. I think that's God is found within, and it's found in nature, and it's found in community, and less so in a human form.
Oh, it's true. I speak as a secular Jew. I've been to the Ohel. I respect Chabad. I
Me too.
participate in Chabad sometimes, but sometimes it's a little off-putting how much the Rebbe is elevated to almost godlike. But that's a whole separate conversation to have. And that's what's great about podcasts. We can touch upon a multitude of topics, honestly, without a PC interference. So I would like to thank you so much. It's been
Thank
such an
you.
honor. I've been following your videos for, I cannot even tell you, like, not to sound like a stalker, but maybe close to a year. And you truly have opened my eyes into more of the Moroccan Jewish relations, into even Moroccan Jewish history. And so when I was putting together the season 2, highlighting more of the Mizrahi experience, you undoubtedly were number one on my list to reach
Oh,
out.
I'm
So
honored to hear that. Thank you
thank you
so
so
much for
much.
having me on. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. And so when you responded positively, I I was overjoyed. So thank you so much. And
I'm
I know
happy to
that
hear it.
our audience has learned a lot. So thank you.
I'm happy to thank you, Lauren, so much. And if you want to get connected to other Sephardic Jews from Syria, from Iraq, from Iran, please do let me know. I'd love for you to get to know the whole range of the people.
Exactly. All right. Thank you so much. And we look forward to connecting again.